going to walk around a little bit while I talk. Yeah. You've probably never been part of a rock group if you had. I was about 10 years old, and my father and I were going fishing one day, and I got up and went into our living room in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where I grew up, and he had spread out on a card table. He was a trial lawyer, a whole lot of yellow pads, and he's taking notes and putting slips and books and so forth. And I said, "Dad, what are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I'm really sorry we're going to have to put off the fishing trip." He said, "I'm getting ready. I expect to get a trial coming up Monday, and I needed to get a lot of work done." I said, "Well, what are you doing right now?" He said, "Well, I'm preparing my opponent's case." I said, "Well, why would you do that?" And he said, "Oh, that's always the way you start." And furthermore, he said, not only the case you think he's going to offer, but the strongest, most powerful, nastiest, most sneaky and crafty thing that is possibly imaginable. Prepare that, figure out how to defeat it, and then your work. I always thought that was kind of an interesting approach toward things. Let me suggest an approach a bit like that today with respect to Messrs. Kim Jong-un and Ahmadinejad. Not just that they might like, or some of their buddies in other countries like China and so forth, might like to steal some money from us, and that's a serious matter, and we have to protect and deal with all of those issues. They're important. But that their objectives are a lot worse than that. Now, it's a common way of discussing these issues to say that somebody, fill in the blank, Ahmadinejad, they're not crazy. If they did that, we might go back and attack them or even use a nuclear weapon, and they're not crazy. Well, there's kind of two parts to crazy. I once wrote a paper on Hitler as a diplomat, and I can assure you that although his objectives were absolutely hideous, to conquer Europe and run it for 1,000 years in an empire and kill all the Jews, his skill as a diplomat was superb. From 1933 to 1939, Hitler had the chanceries of Europe eating out of his hand. He was as good as Metternich at his best. It is not inconsistent for a sociopath like Hitler, or Kim Jong-un, or Ahmadinejad, to have a crazed, evil, world-destroying objective, but still to be a crafty dude. And we have, I think, lapsed into a mode of thinking about the Kim Jong-uns and Ahmadinejads that, well, you know, they're just sort of like your average Soviet leader. Now, let me be clear. I want to be precise about what I mean about this, but I really kind of miss the Soviets. I mean, I spent a lot of years trying to figure out how to deter them and what kind of weapon systems to buy and how to spy on them and stuff. But I also negotiated with them 4 times, and my Soviet counterpart and I would get mad in a meeting. We'd go out to dinner together, and after a couple of glasses of wine, we'd start telling Jewish jokes. And, you know, we could kind of make things work. The Soviet generals are the ones who kept Fidel Castro from persuading the Soviet government to use a nuclear weapon during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We now know from the material that was released that Castro badly wanted a nuclear weapon used during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Why? Because he wanted to destroy the United States, but it would have destroyed Cuba, right? Well, did he care? Not that much. So a Soviet Navy captain stopped his small flotilla from launching NPR special on this a few weeks ago, or PBS special, stopped his small flotilla from using a nuclear torpedo during the Cuban Missile Crisis, something that could have set off nuclear war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So, you know, bless the more or less common sense of at least some Soviet military people. And furthermore, they didn't really want to die for the principle of from each according to his ability to each according to his need. They wanted to modernize their country homes outside Moscow. So we got used to dealing with a more or less enemy that was kind of clumsy and bureaucratic and a lousy economy, which we eventually outperformed. They kind of withered away, and they tossed up a Gorbachev, who's a reasonably decent guy, as their last. I miss him. I miss him. Because what we have now is a couple of people, and there may be more, but at least let's stay with Kim Jong-un and Ahmadinejad, that are quite capable of a lot more than the kind of tensions we had with the Soviets, that appear to be quite capable of Hitler-like thinking and behavior. Now, if they were, taking my father's advice, what might they do? Well, first of all, they would notice that the United States has 18 critical infrastructures: food, water, electricity, natural gas, financial, etc. All 17 of the others depend on electricity. If the electricity grid goes, not just for a few days, as in Sandy, but for months to years, and even part of the country, because in part we haven't stockpiled transformers and haven't done a lot of things we need to do, but let's say months. It's not just your lights that go off. You can't pump gasoline at the filling station because the pump is electric. You can't get food because the delivery systems all depend on things that are electric in one way or another. You can't get water because the pumps don't work. You are not back in the 1980s pre-World Wide Web. You are back in the 1880s pre-electric grid, and I doubt very seriously if you have enough water pump handles and plow horses and seeds to function in a 19th century economy. Some of the estimates on what would be the result of the grid going down for a substantial period of time, let's say a year or more, look very hard at the possibility that you would have 200 million of the 300 million people in the United States dead. Because the agricultural system we have is highly technological, depends a lot on electricity and irrigation and a lot of other things, and will not feed more than about 100 million people at best in its non-electrical, non-networked form. So we are talking about the ability, at least that a Ahmadinejad or a Kim Jong-un could seriously consider, if he hated us enough, if he hates us as much as Hitler hated the Jews, which is a lot, then the possibility of taking down the grid, or at least a big chunk of it, for a substantial period of time via hacking could be something more devastating, really, even than some scenarios in which nuclear weapons are used. Because a nuclear weapon may destroy a city or part of an area, fall out and they kill a number of people, but it's probably not going to fundamentally undercut all of the infrastructure. So what about the possibility of North Koreans or Iranians or somebody else hacking into the grid? Well, the way I feel about the electric grid is kind of bipolar. It's true, as the National Academy of Engineering said not too long ago, that in a way it's the most remarkable invention of the 20th century. It's huge, it covers the continent, it's a just-in-time system, and generally speaking, except when there's a big accident, it gives us all the electricity that we need, and it's really kind of amazing. On the other hand, I feel sort of like Henny Youngman. Take the electricity grid, please. It is, for the first instance, highly fragile. It was put together beginning in the 1880s, really because Tesla went out over Edison. A series of alternating current, long-distance transmission systems followed in smaller areas with distribution, what usually goes on telephone lines. But it is a just-in-time system, so if any part of it is interrupted, a lot of things can be thrown off. It also it used to be, in the time of the childhood or even young adulthood for almost everybody here, it was a system in which if you were in Idaho on the local utility in Boise, and you were seeing some kind of a problem and you needed some electricity from Washington State, you picked up the phone, it was probably something that hung on the wall, and you dialed long distance to the folks over in Washington State. You said, hey, we're going to need some feed here in about 30 minutes. So how are you all doing? Can you help out? Oh, yeah, well, we can do that. Well, it was a couple of guys, and if they communicated after a while by computer, it was local software that some vendor had fixed up so they could talk a bit faster than they could on the phone. But it'd be pretty hard for anybody to get into it. Then in the mid-1990s, we got worried about Y2K. And so we started basically putting the electric grid on the web as we modernized it in such a way that the software worked so it wouldn't crash in Y2K. So it went on the web, the SCADA systems, the supervisory control and data acquisition systems. And about the same time, at the end of the 90s, we basically decontrolled electricity and let it operate on an open market. So you now have an open market all over the country on the web with a lot of very standard software and the control systems operating on systems that lots and lots of people know how to hack. We did all that. We did it in the 90s. And so we now have a system that at least important parts of it can be thrown off relatively easily. I'll use an example the Department of Homeland Security cleared to go on CNN about 3 years ago. I don't know why. I don't think it should have been cleared, but they did, and it's all over the web. Which is one pretty simple hacking maneuver, where you have a spinning machine, 60 cycles, and you want to put another machine into the mix and to synchronize it. Instead of putting them together as in a slow process so they synchronize properly, what you do, if you're a hacker, is that you turn off one of the machines, the other one spins very much faster because of the torque, and then within a second or so, you put them back together again. So the spinning one destroys the other. Well, that was on CNN demonstration up in Idaho 3 years ago. There are other relatively simple tricks, and it would be good if we were dealing with some ways to defeat them. Now, who's in charge? Surely somebody is. Not really. There are 50 public utility commissions that are kind of sort of in charge each of their state. They're more or less run by retired electricity utility executives. And there are not very many of them that are out front with respect to research and development. The deputy director of ARPA-E, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for the Department of Energy, told me a couple of weeks ago that if you take the research and development done last year by all 3,500 American utilities and add it together, it is less than the R&D that is done by the American dog food industry. Now, we have pretty healthy dogs, so, you know, but there is no interest in the industry in dealing with these problems. There is a sort of tragedy of the commons problem, that each utility says, well, if I fix things, stockpile transformers and do other stuff, and my neighbor goes down, he'll probably take me down too, so I'll be wasting money, and so I'm not going to do anything unless everybody has to do it. Well, who would everybody be? Certainly not 50 public utility commissions. How about the Department of Energy? They've got an assistant secretary and a small staff that does some studies. How about, but you kind of look around and try, how about FERC? Yeah, well, they regulate the cost of transmission. That's about it. How about NERC? Well, they regulate some aspects of distribution. That's about it. Well, is anybody in charge? No. Why don't we have a national energy strategy? Because nobody's in charge. So we are in a situation where that whole set of issues is extremely troubling. Now, since I've been so happy and optimistic, let me leave you with one other, I'm afraid, rather difficult problem. We heard about electromagnetic pulse, and it is true that about once a century we get a solar event called the Carrington event that is a huge electromagnetic pulse, naturally caused, and the last time we had one, which was a century and a half ago in 1859, there were a few telegraphs and so forth around, but everybody is quite clear it was an absolutely devastating electric storm. There have been smaller ones that were still quite devastating to more modern electronics in the more recent era in the 1920s. But the most data comes from the Russian and to a limited extent the American open air nuclear detonations that occurred in 1962 before the Atmospheric Test Ban Treaty took effect. And there were not too many transistors, I mean there were some transistors, there weren't too very many integrated circuits around then, but there were a few. And looking at the effect of those, both the Americans and Russians came to the conclusion that a storm of the sort that occurred in 1859 could be absolutely devastating to all electronics. The Russians, I'm afraid the Chinese, now the Israelis and the British are all hardening their electrical systems against electromagnetic pulse of the solar type. We are not, because nobody's in charge. And just one final point, it's possible to create such a pulse with the detonation of a relatively simple nuclear weapon. It doesn't have to be sophisticated, just has to go off 50 miles up, let's say, in a simple orbit. So we have, to put it mildly, a very major cyber problem that is a first cousin to an explosive problem. They all have to do with the vulnerability of the electric grid, the fact that we have not done a responsible job in taking care of our infrastructure in such a way that we can keep something like that from happening. We've got a lot of work to do.